It's nearly Christmas. It's a time of charity, festivity, and goodwill towards all. Of course, in that spirit, we're going to be talking about... Now, Snyder is one of those topics that people tend to get quite shouty about. In fact, I'm fairly sure the comments for this video are going to be quite contentious. That said, I'm hoping we can keep it relatively civil.
Make no mistake, I will fucking kill you.
Quick sidebar here. Snide-bar. I don't normally talk in the first person in these videos. I tend to like taking a step back and looking at culture and context and so on. However, given the kind of response that talking about Snyder in any context generates, both from fans and haters, it's worth being upfront here about my own personal feelings concerning Snyder. I don't really feel that strongly one way or the other about him. He's not one of my guys. I don't think he's one of the best directors working today, and I also don't think he's one of the worst. I think there are plenty of directors better than him who've never gotten the same opportunities. But I also think there are plenty of directors worse than him who've been given far better chances. I think he's made good films and not so good films. Crucially though, with one exception I'm not going to name, feel free to guess in the comments, I think he's always made his own films. In what I've read of him in interviews, he seems like a nice guy. People enjoy working with him, to the point that many actors will reteam with him on a variety of projects. He and his family have endured a tragedy that is unimaginable to any parent, and the way that he and his cast were treated by Warner Bros. In the wake of that tragedy does little to endear that large faceless corporation to me. Indeed, given the abuse that occurred on the set of Justice League, and the fact that the resulting movie is one of the most soulless blockbusters I have ever seen,
Yeah. Oh, something is definitely bleeding.
I'm on record as thinking it's nice that Snyder got to finish his own movie. So, I don't have particularly strong feelings about Snyder one way or the other, which makes the intensity of the discourse around him particularly fascinating to me, which means that this is, ironically, probably going to be a spicier take than usual, just by virtue of being somewhat agnostic on the topic. End Snide-bar. Snyder has a new movie coming out on Netflix this Christmas, Rebel Moon. Now, this is not a review show, but Rebel Moon is... fine, I guess? Rebel Moon may not be the best Snyder movie, but it is perhaps the most Snyder movie. And not just because it's being split across 2 parts and getting a 4-hour director's cut. All of Snyder's weaknesses are on display here. It's a film with no real connective tissue, populated by archetypes rather than characters, occasionally feeling more like a set of storyboards than a finished film. And it even has that familiar Snyder issue, where his emphasis on either intense close-ups or epic wide shots leads him to eschew medium shots, which can make it difficult to get a sense of where objects are in relation to one another, particularly when dealing with a large-ish ensemble. Some of these issues will likely be fixed by Snyder's promised director's cut, which will undoubtedly flesh out characters' backstory in the larger universe, while other problems are just who he is as a director. At the same time, Rebel Moon demonstrates Snyder's strengths. It's visceral and aggressive. It's dynamic. It moves to its own beat. Despite the copious amounts of computer-generated imagery and color grading, it somehow feels more tactile than a lot of modern movies set in something ostensibly closer to the real world. It's the kind of movie that it feels like you could touch, and it'd be sweaty. It also has an impressive scale. Snyder reportedly shot both Rebel Moon movies for $165 million combined, so the first half looks more vivid and imaginative than blockbusters that have multiples of that budget. And it's good that the orcs from Bride are still getting work.
Never gonna stop.
Rebel Moon is big, it's ambitious, it's weird. It has a significantly greater amount of tentacle porn than you expect in a Christmas blockbuster. It is unapologetically and uncompromisingly Snyder, and that's why it's, if not great, at least interesting. Regardless of the movie's quality, it's good that this movie exists, and it's crazy that Netflix have given it the primo Christmas release slot previously reserved for movies like Glass Onion or Don't Look Up. Even if Rebel Moon is more interesting than it is good, we frankly need more blockbusters like this.
We really did have everything, didn't we?
Rebel Moon is Zack Snyder's Star Wars movie. And I don't mean that in a metaphorical way, I mean it in a very literal fashion. As in, Snyder went to Lucasfilm and asked them could he make a Star Wars film? And then, when they said no, he marched over to Netflix and said, "Hey, how'd you guys like to make my space fight movie? Do it." This is obvious just looking at the film, with its rebels, its laser swords, and its effete British robots.
Thank the maker. This oil bath is going to feel so good.
The opening sequence even includes a riff on Lucas's opening shot of Star Wars, with the camera panning down through space to a planet, and the hero is introduced as a farmer on a barren world on the Outer Rim, while the villain is a space Nazi with a British accent. There's even a smuggler who may or may not throw in with our plucky rebels. No spoilers. However, Rebel Moon is not just Snyder ripping off Star Wars. It's Snyder synthesizing his interests in a variety of other films and media. Like Snyder's Justice League, the structure and plot of the film are a riff on Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, in which a rural village is beset by thugs, and our heroes set out to assemble a team of 7 scattered warriors to stand and fight. Like his DCU films, there's a lot of Arthurian legend here, particularly indebted to John Borman's Wild and Wacky Excalibur. The film's robot butler literally wears the Grail on their chest, which is a metaphor for a royal bloodline that can also miraculously heal people. Also, there's a lost king who may be the once and future king, who knows. It's also worth noting that Anthony Hopkins' role here as a narrating robot evokes Transformers: The Last Knight, another movie saturated with Arthurian imagery. In that movie, Anthony Hopkins plays the guy who owns the effete British robot.
Of all the Earls I have had the pleasure to serve, you are by far the coolest.
Now, no studio executive in the history of Hollywood has ever suggested, what if Star Wars but Seven Samurai and Excalibur but shot in the style of a shaving commercial? Because they'd be asked to leave the meeting via the nearest window. If one of Hollywood's new AI algorithms generated such a response, executives would assume that we were only hours away from Skynet. These days, most studio decisions amount to, what if Star Wars, but more? What if Marvel, but 8 episodes? Modern Hollywood has become increasingly dependent on existing intellectual properties and franchises, recycled and repeated to the point of meaninglessness. Here's that thing you like from that thing you like, which means that this is now a thing that you like.
I understood that reference.
And there is some sense that audiences are maybe tiring of this. This year has not been a great year for live-action superhero universes, allowing for the exception of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, a movie very much closing off its story. Even outside of superhero franchises, existing properties like Transformers, Indiana Jones, The Fast and the Furious, Mission Impossible, and The Exorcist have had rough years. This isn't to say that audiences don't want franchises, they just want new brands. The first theatrically released Super Mario Bros. Movie in 30 years was a massive hit. Barbie was a smash, in large part due to the distinct perspective of director Greta Gerwig. The kids turned out for Five Nights at Freddy's, or FNAF, because I am hip and with it. Hell, you could argue that the target audience for The Exorcist Believer rustled up more enthusiasm for the Pope's Exorcist instead. No, we did a Russell joke a couple of weeks ago in the Godzilla episode. I am better than that. Hell, you could argue that the target audience for The Exorcist Believer was too busy crowing about the Pope's Exorcist. Such is the way. Change is natural. All things have a season. After all, these franchises that we know and love were all fresh and exciting at one point in the past. George Lucas didn't set out to make a Star Wars movie, he set out to make his own riff on Flash Gordon, bringing in his own love of Akira Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress or Michael Anderson's The Dam Busters.
I got him! Great kid! Don't get cocky!
Over the past 6 years, the Star Wars universe has grown increasingly insular and self-referential. You no longer just have a show about a guy who looks like Boba Fett. You now have a show about Boba Fett, which for 2 episodes becomes a show about the guy who looks like Boba Fett. With the exception of Tony Gilroy's Andor, which obviously owes a lot to Gilroy's fondness for movies like The Battle of Algiers, these are Star Wars projects that take their primary influence from Star Wars. They are photocopies of photocopies of photocopies.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
It wasn't always this way. For decades, Hollywood operated under a practice that film critic Scott Mendelson has described as rip-off, don't remake. The idea was that studios and filmmakers could take a look at a film that worked and come up with a suspiciously similar substitute with a tweak or two. So, Michael Bay could watch 1960s James Bond movies, think to himself, man, Sean Connery's really good as a suave British Secret Service agent, and then build The Rock around casting Sean Connery as a suave British Secret Service agent. Now, if you squint, you can imagine The Rock as a postscript about what happened to Sean Connery's James Bond after Diamonds Are Forever, because anybody involved in that movie probably deserves to go to prison. But you don't have to. Along those lines, Tony Scott could watch Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation and reimagine it as Enemy of the State, even casting Gene Hackman in a similar role. But because they were technically distinct, nobody got too precious about turning a moody 70s character study into a bombastic 90s action movie. Again, if you squint, you can imagine Enemy of the State as a Lego sequel to The Conversation, but it's not really. And the process is iterative. The recent Equalizer films are technically a reboot of the classic show of the same name, but they owe more to Denzel Washington's collaboration with Tony Scott on Man on Fire. These are movies in which Washington plays a retired Special Forces operative who finds himself drawn back into action to protect a young girl. In fact, The Equalizer 3, or The Threequalizer, goes out of its way to cast Dakota Fanning, who was Washington's co-star in Man on Fire. This just used to be how filmmaking worked, allowing directors a great deal of latitude to take things they liked and put their own spin on them in a way that is very hard today. If you want to get a sense of how the landscape has changed, consider the career of James Mangold, one of the great unsung studio filmmakers of the past 30 years. He spent his first 20 years in the business hopping between genres. A Sundance indie which asked the probing question, what if there was a fat guy? A Scorsese knockoff. An Oscar bait performance piece. A romantic comedy. An adaptation of that joke in Adaptation.
We find out that the killer really suffers from multiple personality disorder. He's actually really the cop and the girl. Isn't that fucked up?
A music biopic. A remake of a classic western. And a Tom Cruise film. However, of the 4 films Mangold has made since 2010, 3 of them are franchise films, and one of them is a thinly veiled metaphor for working in the modern studio system.
Man comes to my office with an idea, that man keeps his job.
And his future apparently includes a Star Wars project and a DC movie. And don't get me wrong, I love Logan. It may be Mangold's best film, and The Wolverine is a far more interesting film than many give it credit for, but it does feel like the range of films that Mangold gets to make has gotten significantly narrower in the past decade. It's worse for younger talent. These days, directors like Ryan Coogler or Nia DaCosta go from making a beloved indie film, to making a mid-budget Lego sequel that performs well, to directing a superhero franchise film. Then, in many cases, they don't get to put their mark on it. Directors like Lucretia Martel have talked about being told that they won't get to direct the action in their own movies. The Marvels might be the most expensive film ever directed by a woman of color, but Nia DaCosta has talked about how it's not really her film. It is a Kevin Feige production, she told Vanity Fair. It's his movie. So I think you live in that reality, but I tried to go in with the knowledge that some of you is going to take a back seat. What's the point in this approach? Why would you hire a talented filmmaker if you're not going to let them make their film? Why would I want to go see a Nia DaCosta movie where she takes a back seat? And so we circle back to Zack Snyder. What's interesting about Snyder's career is that it adopts the inverse trajectory of the larger industry. He began his career directing remakes like Dawn of the Dead or adaptations like 300 and Watchmen. Then he was placed at the helm of a sprawling franchise, the DCEU. In fact, part of the reason that those movies remain so contentious is that they are Snyder movies. They retain a strong sense of identity at a time when blockbuster filmmaking was becoming increasingly homogenous. However, Snyder's recent movies are much more in the rip-off, don't remake school. Army of the Dead is obviously massively indebted to Dawn of the Dead, but it is its own thing in its own continuity. It is even, with all due respect to the Grey Man shared universe, the rare Netflix movie to have actually materialized a spin-off, Army of Thieves. Rebel Moon, as we mentioned, is Zack Snyder's Star Wars, and is ironically much closer to what Lucas was doing with Star Wars than anything in, say, The Rise of Skywalker. In this context, it's worth acknowledging Gareth Edwards the creator, another imperfect film that finds Edwards ripping off and not remaking, in this case a movie indebted to Apocalypse Now and Blade Runner. Like Snyder, Edwards is a filmmaker who worked in the franchise machine before breaking out on his own. Like Rebel Moon, the creator offers impressive spectacle on a modest budget. At a time when movies like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and Fast X struggle to break even due to massive budgets, maybe Hollywood should pay attention to what Snyder and Edwards were doing, at least in terms of logistics and budgeting. Rebel Moon is unlikely to be the cornerstone of a sprawling multimedia shared universe, and that's okay. As much as the sassy blue tentacle bug is my favorite movie character of 2023, with all due respect to J. Robert Oppenheimer, I don't need an 8-episode streaming origin story. However, for all their individual flaws, it's movies like Rebel Moon and the creator that are more likely to guide studios towards new properties and new ideas than recycled rehashes and nostalgic cameos from existing properties. Rebel Moon might not be a great movie. It might not even be a particularly good movie. But it's good that it exists. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop. Okay, in case anybody cares, the exception I would argue is Man of Steel. It feels very much like a Christopher Nolan movie. It's the only one of the DCEU movies in which Nolan has a story credit, and it feels very much informed by how Nolan approaches superheroes, as reflected in his work on the Dark Knight trilogy. It's also notable as being the only film in the series that tries to actually develop Metropolis into a real place populated by real people, in the style of Nolan's Gotham City, as he did with gangsters, politicians, and cops. At the climax of Man of Steel, Nolan tries to get us to care about the human people involved in the crisis, but Snyder's not really particularly interested in that. That's why the Battle of Metropolis is much more interesting in Batman vs. Superman. There he's able to capture the scale, the spectacle, the majesty, and the horror of it in a way that doesn't necessarily gel with how it's portrayed in Man of Steel. However one feels about them, I think the Batman vs. Superman and Zack Snyder's Justice League are much more Snyder's films than Man of Steel was. If anybody cares.